I've been meaning to interview today's guest for quite a while. He was a high school friend of one of my younger brothers who turned me on to him years ago. And I put it off. Now he's moved to L.A. I figured it's high time. Henry Jenkins, my guest today, writes about what he calls convergence culture and subtitles his book by that name, Where Old and New Media Collide. Top-down commercial output media meets bottom-up amateur do-it-yourself media. And remember, the word amateur comes from amor. Amateur is what we do because we love it, not because we're not talented. Rather than spin my own ideas and notions about this collision, I plan to learn as you do in my conversation with Professor Jenkins, a professor who named his blog Aka Fan, declaring himself to be both an academic and a fan. Henry Jenkins is newly the Provost Professor of Communications, Journalism, and Cinematic Art at the University of Southern California. Until recently, he served as the co-founder of the Comparative Media Studies program at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His newest books include Convergence Culture, Where Old and New Media Collide, and Fans, Bloggers, and Gamers, Exploring Participatory Culture. And you can learn more, read his blogs, by going to henryjenkins.org. Welcome to L.A.
Delighted to be here.
Great. I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the ideas and the work before we get into that stuff. So, what's your path evolving from, I assume, fan to now academic and fan, and then finally, how did you decide that you could stay in both worlds?
Well, it's been a complex journey. My passion for media is what drew me to studying media in the first place. But when I got to graduate school, I noticed that intellectuals didn't always love popular media or popular culture. And indeed, most of the theoretical stuff I was being taught in graduate school was largely hostile. And I was facing this sort of strange contradiction. I was reading theorists who were saying the average audience member is passive, a couch potato, apathetic, makes indifferent decisions. And I was going and hanging out at cons with people who were staying up all night to passionately discuss their favorite television shows and books and movies, who were editing even back then videos. Sure.
When you said cons, you didn't mean con, the French.
No, I mean conventions, fan conventions.
Comic-Con, this con,
yes,
that
exactly.
con. Yeah.
So in that space, you'll see people passionately discussing the contents of their culture, sliding over rather quickly into discussions of politics and intellectual property, creating things themselves, whether they're amateur films or videos, music, fiction, costumes. So this is far from a passive audience. It was very much an active audience. And so there was this weird whiplash I was getting between what I was seeing with my own eyes television audiences were doing and what my professors were teaching me. And I gradually found my way to a theoretical tradition that allowed me to write about that. Cultural studies coming from Birmingham in the UK is a tradition that is both political and culturally oriented, and it really explores what people do with media in their everyday life and assumes we have agency. We have the ability to make a difference. We can take media in our own hands and use it to change ourselves in the world.
You know, I'm going to jump in on one thing, one of the last lines you said. You said we have agency. Earlier this year, or actually maybe the end of last year, I interviewed Stuart Kaufman. I don't know if you know his work or not. He's a biologist, a very, Aspen Institute kind of guy. He has a new book called Reinventing the Sacred. And what he says is the key in his whole analysis of evolution and so on is agency. That the predictability even of natural law changed when life got agency. So it's interesting that you're using that same term, which is not one we hear all the time, to describe, I think, how an audience, a viewer, a citizen changes.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the language we use to critique media and the culture, and especially in the legacy of the culture war, acts as if we have no agency, as if mass media simply ruled over us and we had no choice about how we made sense of the world around us, as if We played violent video games, and we automatically turned into psycho killers shooting up our schools. Those images, I think, take away the potential for democratic participation. That is, if we care about democracy, we have to start from the premise that people have the ability to act individually and collectively in a way that changes the world. And that's the heart of what I found in the fan community. This is a community that acts, that tries to make a difference. I was at a Harry Potter convention up in San Francisco over the weekend and met there with a young man named Andrew Slack. And Andrew Slack's from Boston. He created an organization called the Harry Potter Alliance. The Harry Potter Alliance now was designed to take the stories of Harry Potter and use it as a platform for social change. His theory is that the Harry Potter story is about a young man who fought evil in his society, questioned authority, organized his classmates, and tried to change the world. And if we build a Dumbledore's army for the real world, it could make a difference. And he's organized now more than 100,000 young people around Darfur, around workers' rights at Walmart, around equal rights for marriage, around fair trade. His current effort is getting people to boycott chocolate manufactured in Harry Potter's name because the companies contracted or from unfair labor conditions, and they want to push Warner Brothers into taking a different franchise to deal with the candy rights.
I love
Harry
that.
Potter.
What's the age group that obviously Harry Potter starts, 7, 8, we know it goes into adult, but what's the age that he's found his 100,000?
Well, they run from people still in high school, maybe some people are so young they couldn't even vote, to senior citizens, working together toward common cause. And he does so in a way that's playful, that taps their imagination. I think a lot of activism has adopted an attitude which is both puritanical in that it denies pleasure, and Spartan in that it denies emotion. And the push toward a pure rational politics, I think, undercuts our ability to use the power of popular culture to change the world.
And it probably suits very well those who treat politics as a serious, almost a war, and win with the one who has the most money in the game.
Right now, we think of our political leaders as wonks, right? And those are people...
Well, we didn't our last one.
Yeah, we didn't, but that's true.
But we held it against him.
But when we think of the wonk, we think of someone who's the brightest person in the room, and they make us feel like we know nothing. I want us to think about our political leadership as geeks. That is, when we geek out, we go deep, we get passionate, we involve ourselves with other people, and we become networkers. And so I want to reclaim this idea of geeking out for democracy as a way of thinking about the way the fan world bridges over into the political sector. And I think the Obama campaign illustrated pretty well the ways in which popular culture and social networks can be mobilized to change the world. And we're seeing the same thing now with Iran and the Twitter revolution that's taking place. They're both examples of a kind of geek-style approach to politics as opposed to a wonk-style approach.
If someone said, what is convergence culture? Or what is participatory culture? You've given a few examples on, but I know from reading and listening to some of your talks, you have others that I think will grab listeners and make these ideas make sense.
Oh, well, let's start with convergence culture. When the industry talks about convergence, they're normally talking about which black box all of our media is going to flow through. Is it the set-top box, which was a theory at one time? Was it a game system? Now everyone's saying it's the iPhone that we're going to consume all of our media from. But that's the thing on a technological level. And most of us, in fact, are not there. That we have in our living room many black boxes. The cords are tangled. The remotes are lost. We don't know how to connect technologically yet. My students carry more pieces of equipment in their pockets than the average GI during the Vietnam War era carried with them. So we're not technically converged. But if we think of convergence as a cultural process, then a world where every story, every sound, every image, every relationship plays out across every available channel. So the whole mediascape becomes interconnected through our use of it. Right. That's what I mean by convergence culture.
So the box is not really a box. The place the convergence takes place is in the individual and the group that participates.
Absolutely. It's inside us. So if I'm taking input from the radio and typing it into my Twitter account and it's updating my Facebook page and it becomes fodder for someone else's blog, then I'm involved in a convergence culture where there's some of those people were using a variety of tools and technologies to access it. And so if we start to think about that, then we realize this is if it's an entire system, then the grassroots use of it, the citizens' use of media, is as much part of that system as corporate media is, that the decisions that are shaping the future of media are made in teenagers' bedrooms as often as they're made in corporate boardrooms. And those things work together.
And you mean that more than just that those kids are deciding what they'll watch or what they'll spend time with. You're saying that actually their participation, their response, their messages end up influencing what those guys do, whereas maybe 20, 30 years ago, ratings was about as far as it went.
Yeah, and then you might have been skeptical of this until you look at YouTube. You know, the YouTube in the last couple of years has profoundly shaped the flow of media within our culture, and it's profoundly shaped the content of media. It shapes the content insofar young people are producing content, and more of us are spending time looking at amateur content than ever before. That there are video bloggers and remixers and so forth who really have hit massive circulation. They also reflect the flow. Think about the Susan Boyle phenomenon of just a month or so back. Susan Boyle content from a UK show that was not available commercially in the United States was seen by 5 to 6 times the number of people who watched the final broadcast of American Idol last season.
Now that's amazing. If anyone didn't hear that, this is I'm Terry McNally speaking with Henry Jenkins. He's newly going to be at USC and writes about convergent culture. That Susan Boyle's video was seen by 5 times the finals of American Idol's audience, which was the biggest audience for anything but sports this year?
Yes. So grassroots media channels are burying mass media channels at the present moment. Now, we don't yet know how to use them fully to our own interest, right? We're playing around with things right now that we're quickly learning to apply to more serious means. So that, 2 years ago, Twitter was about updating your friends on what you had for lunch. Last month, it was how people in Iran updated Americans about aspects of their political crisis that the mainstream media wasn't covering. Ethan Zuckerman, who runs a major blog on global issues, says that any technology sufficient to allow us to share cute cat pictures can bring down a government. And I think that's probably a true description of the moment that we're at, where these grassroots channels, or what I'm calling participatory culture, that is culture we create collectively, has the power to change or challenge powerful institutions. We don't always use it that way, and we still live in a world where there's more influence exerted by Fox News than by most individuals using it. But whether there's more influence in our culture exerted by Fox News or the aggregate of contributors to YouTube, I think is an open question. We just tend to underestimate the sort of gradual shifts that are taking place as the average citizens gain control of the ability to produce and distribute media.
Great. One thing I wanted to refer back to was when you said that politics too often acts like it's a mental, a top-down, a rational, serious. And I was going to mention the book by Stephen Duncombe. The name I'm forgetting right now.
Yeah, Dream. It's called Dream, and I'm forgetting the subtitle myself.
Yeah.
But Duncombe's book is really amazing.
I had him on the show, and anybody who's interested in this idea, and hopefully people are, of how politics has to get its party on, and how politics is more than what goes on those channels or on the opinion page and so on, or in Washington in the Beltway. Stephen Duncombe, D-U-N. C-O-M-B,
yeah.
Right? And there's a Dream is in the title, but neither one of us can remember the full rest of it. Okay. One of the things I also heard you saying was that when you're saying that the convergence is taking place in us and so on, is one of the misnomers that I think many have come to understand over the last few years was that commercial media, the idea was they produced programming and that their product was programming. I think about 10 or 15 years ago, people began to realize that their product was eyeballs. That, in fact, programming was merely a means to an end, and the end was eyeballs. That sounds to me like what's changing now. Well, we're unwilling to just be eyeballs.
Yeah, we refuse to just be eyeballs. We refuse to be reduced to eyeballs that are sold to sponsors. We're insisting that if eyeballs are valuable, then we should have some say in how they're spent. And if we're generating value behind a media product, then we should get a share of that value. If our choices are what determine what reaches television, then we should have real democratic mechanisms of exerting those choices.
And you point out that some of the interesting questions this raises, and one I'm just thinking of is that YouTube sold for how much?
$1 billion.
$1 billion. So what made YouTube so popular? Well, I guess one could go back and look at over YouTube's existence. What were the most popular? You point out a couple of Chinese kids started singing Backstreet Boys songs, and that was an early hit. Now, did they get a penny?
No, and in fact, that's one of the questions about the whole era of Web 2.0, that Web 2.0 business models are based on user-generated content, user moderation, user aggregation. All the work is done by the users. And, one of the joke definitions of Web 2.0 is we do all the work, you make all the money. So the question is whether there should be revenue sharing or not, and that's a complex question, or whether there should be greater control by the user side of some of these companies and the decisions they make. Minimally, as fights around Facebook and LiveJournal have suggested, we want to control what happens to the content that we produce. We don't want
gets to see
take it away, who gets to see it. Can suddenly our privacy settings change and our information is flooded to our friends that we didn't think they'd have access to. So there's the first 2 years ago, that excitement was about Web 2.0 companies generating value for industry. The last year and a half has been struggles over consumer labor, essentially, and the rights of consumers in relation to these companies and the policies that need to be in place to reflect that. Now, the Convergence Culture Consortium, which I helped to run, really is looking at how non-commercial sources of value relate to commercial sources of value. So we often talk about a gift economy. That's an economy where value is created through social relationships. It operates on different rules than a commodity system, a system where money, objects are exchanged for money. If I go into Starbucks and buy coffee, I'm not obligated to talk to the woman behind the counter. If I went to your living room and asked for a cup of coffee and I said nothing to you for the whole time I was there, I would be phenomenally rude. We operate in different systems when we're operating in a commercial and a non-commercial economy. And what we're seeing with Web 2.0 is those two worlds are being brought together. And week by week, you see conflicts.
Yeah, because there are no rules yet for this emerging thing.
Amazon last week took off the Kindle.
That was
1984.
My next comment.
Exactly, and so Amazon goes into sold people books. They put it on their Kindle. Amazon goes into the Kindle and takes the book back because it's in violation of intellectual property.
Had they just taken it off their list, which I'm sure they wish they had now, that you couldn't get it tomorrow anymore, that would be one thing. But they went into the Kindle you've already downloaded, you've already out to you, and pulled it away. And the irony, of course, was what those books were.
Yeah, it's Orwell. So it's just like, imagine a bookstore going to your living room and taking books off your shelf. But it's worse than that because the Kindle allows you to annotate the books and people write on them. They took away people's notes. And there was an interview in the New York Times where someone said they didn't just take their work, they took my work. Stuff I'd contributed that was valuable to this experience.
So what's interesting is here you have a commercial company who knew enough to add the function that you could annotate and you could participate, and didn't know enough that was yours.
And that's the mindset that many companies are at. I mean, I go and talk to corporate groups all the time, and you see around the board table some people who are what I call collaborationists. They want to work closely with the audience. They know they've got to facilitate audience desires and interests if they're going to survive long term. And on the other end of the table, they're the prohibitionists who want to control intellectual property, want to regulate consumer behavior. So you hear stories of Cartoon Network released a video to YouTube and then got a cease and desist letter from the legal department of their same company telling them to take it down. The companies are literally chasing each other's their own tails as they're struggling with what the rules should be as participatory culture meets, the era of corporate media.
And as I know you point out, and I'm speaking with Henry Jenkins. He's the author of Convergence Culture and Fans, Bloggers, and Gamers. You can learn more about what we're talking about here, including reading his frequent blogs, at henryjenkins.org. You point out that there will be people at a company that want to do these cease and desist, and there'll be someone else to say, wait a minute, that's given us our biggest boost to popularity ever.
Yeah, so companies are buying a vowel, so to speak. They're getting a clue. They're beginning to see that the potential of this is there, but they don't necessarily, that's not uniformity around the boardroom. And so the legal department can be very conservative. The marketing department can be really eager to reach out and enfranchise consumers to spread the word about their product. creative may have deeply conflicted feelings, wanting people to respond emotionally to what they produced, but worried about losing creative control over characters and stories they've constructed.
Or
losing
not
money.
Getting the royalties and the residuals.
They've all seen the record industry crash and burn by suing its consumers, but they don't yet know whether things like Hulu, which gives content away to consumers, will work or not as a way of keeping, say, the television networks in the game.
What are the early returns? In other words, it seems to me that we've gone through something like this over and over again. Television was going to kill radio, and it didn't. Television was going to kill film, and in fact, it boosted film. Cable was going to kill regular TV, but it didn't, et cetera, et cetera. What are the early returns on what the free distribution of things which otherwise have commercials or otherwise cost money?
I mean, the early signs are that, in fact, it is creating value for the networks, that people may download episodes on the web but end up going to buy the box set of DVDs when it comes out. You know, that they may choose to support the sponsors of companies that produce television shows that matter to them, even when they don't have to. And indeed, fans are becoming savvy enough that they understand that supporting the sponsor may get them what they want. So Chuck fans the other week organized a boycott for Subway. Subway was a sponsor of the television show Chuck. It was in danger of being canceled. They went into Subway stores across the country, bought sandwiches on a particular day and signed notes saying Chuck sent me. And Subway signed on and renewed the show and kept it on the air.
Now, you also talk about Stargate, which is an interesting one in talking about, as we say, these folks who have been for years been perceived as eyeballs we get to sell, actually saying, wait a minute, we want to influence what you do with our shows. Tell them the Stargate story.
Stargate was in danger of being canceled. Within 48 hours, there was an elaborate website up that had a variety of ways of supporting the show. The most interesting was they had petitions in many, many languages around the world because they recognized that Stargate still made money in countries outside the U.S., and simply was declining ratings inside the American context. And so they got those networks to exert pressure back on the production company and saying America shouldn't dictate the production of stories that are being shipped worldwide.
Yeah, in other words, you can't you shouldn't have it both ways. You get global audiences, but you control the production and the life of something like this by what it does next door to you. And they're saying just because it's produced in America, just because it's owned in America, it should. What was the outcome of that?
I mean, the franchise is certainly well and surviving. I think there's been some adjustments on the show, but there was real response to it, I think, in the end. There was yet another successful campaign. One of my favorite stories along this line was the Browncoats, who organized around Firefly and Serenity, Joss Whedon's science fiction series. They parked themselves in malls to get people to know about the film when it came out and publicized it. As soon as it was over, the studio sent them a cease and desist letter and tried to fine them for unauthorized uses of images from the series. So they went online and they asked everyone to put in how many hours they dedicated to publicizing the show, and they added them all up and sent an invoice to the studio for billable hours. Said, this is the work we did for you. It more than cancels out the debt you think we owe you for intellectual property. And that was a case where the studio backed down and conceded that fans had generated greater value for the company than they had cost.
You know, one thought I had as we're talking about the free labor that the audience does, that we do. Alvin Toffler, in his most recent book, which was not nearly as earth-shaking or popular as some of the earlier ones, but what was one of the main things he talked about was he said, we are now becoming prosumers, that we are now doing work we may or may not get any savings for, the fact that we book our own tickets and we do all of these things.
Yeah, so there has been an outsourcing of work back to consumers again, which has to be met with something. I mean, if we're doing that, then we should get money back, we should get savings, we should have greater say. And, you know, there needs to be a kind of consumer rights movement around this Web 2.0 shift. And that's what a number of people in fan communities and gamer communities and activists are starting to argue. What is the Bill of Rights of the consumer?
Because it spreads, in that case, it spreads way beyond media. Media, I think, is where the attention goes. But in fact, it's in so many things we do, they sell it to us and we buy it for convenience. In fact, I would rather have the freedom to do something at 1 a.m. online in my pajamas than have to go into a store and do it.
Yeah, I'd much rather have that level of control, but nevertheless, it is a cost-saving effort for these companies.
Right, and not only that, we, the consumers, are being fired from these companies because we've been replaced by ourselves.
Well, there was a network executive several years ago who's outraged that people were not using TiVos to skip commercials. And he said, it's in the contract that you're supposed to sit and watch the commercials because we provide you with free entertainment. And that led to people saying, we want to renegotiate our contract. Because that's
I haven't
the case.
seen a contract.
Yes, exactly. I never signed that contract. If it were a contract, I'm getting worked harder and harder because there are more commercials per hour than ever before, and I'm getting less and less pay for that contract. If
the pay is the show.
If the pay is the show. So if we go down that avenue, we're really getting screwed as workers in the culture industries.
Let me see. You also you give as a great example of this convergence, the Matrix, and so remind people of that, or there's probably some other examples similar to that.
Sure. With the chapter in the Matrix and convergence culture, what I'm talking about is what is transmedia storytelling, and this is the idea that once we have stories that move across media, storytellers have an expanded canvas to work with. They can use each of those media to reinforce each other. It's no longer stamping a logo on a widget and saying, this is Star Trek. With The Matrix, the Matrix existed across 3 films, about 25 issues of comic books, 12 anime shorts, multiple video games, and the information about that world was dispersed across all of their channels. And the producers thought, and rightly to some degree, that fans would put all that information together. We become hunters and gatherers who track it down and stitch it together. So more recent shows like Lost or Heroes have taken that principle at least that far, if not further, and indeed the term transmedia is one that's shaping the way Hollywood operates.
Yeah, one of the things you say is it's a new person sits down to watch Lost for the first time, and that's what they get, is Lost. But people who have been interacting with it and filling each other's blanks, you talk about an example of a show that was 16 years ago. Many years ago, you watched something in a discussion group rather than by yourself?
Well, what I was talking about was Twin Peaks, right? Well, I did one of the first online ethnographies, and when Twin Peaks first came on and the internet was hitting, and what happened was critics were saying Twin Peaks was getting so complex no one could understand it, and the people on the discussion list kept saying Twin Peaks has become so simple it's uninteresting. What it showed early on was that as we start to watch television through social networks, we're going to demand greater complexity. Indeed, writers have been making that argument that everything bad for good is good for you. Stephen Johnson's book makes the argument that contemporary television is becoming more and more complex. That far from dumbing down, it's demanding greater intellectual agility. And I would argue it does that because we can bring each other up to speed. So if I sit down and watch Lost and I'm lost, what I turn to is Lostpedia. And Lostpedia, like Wikipedia, is consumer-driven. People put up information, they put a rich reference source that allows me to follow any strand on Lost and find out what happened, bringing together the information across many episodes and many different media channels. So we're ready collectively to deal with a much more complex show than we were given. Well, take, for example, Pokemon. There are more than 250 Pokemon characters. Each of whom has different antagonisms and friendships, different states of being. It's a system more complex than the periodic table. Yet we don't talk about kids needing remedial Pokemon. Your kid can't understand Pokemon. Yet our schools are saying you can't learn 12 Greek gods. Right? So who's dumbing us down? Is it popular culture or is it the contemporary standardized education system that holds our knowledge, our brains in contempt?
And the audience age for Pokemon?
Pokemon's playground. We're talking 4, 5, 6-year-olds. So the people argue with Pokemon that anytime, no one could know all of the Pokemon, but anytime 2 kids anywhere get together on the playground, they start comparing notes and they teach each other some new things about Pokemon. The show is designed to be consumed in a social network, and indeed most television will be consumed that way as more and more we're watching TV with one hand and using our laptop with the other.
Hopefully we don't do the same thing when we're driving. We've kind of talked about what convergence culture is, what's going on out there. What you were well ensconced at MIT. What brings you to USC, and what are you going to be doing there?
Well, I was in MIT for almost 20 years.
Wow.
I was a full professor at MIT, head of an academic unit. thought I was settled there, but a number of things happened, some internal to MIT. But what drew me to Southern California was I'd spent 20 years watching all this stuff unfold from the digital side of things, the new media side. And clearly, I wanted to understand from the belly of the beast how Hollywood was thinking about these changes and what we could learn by getting closer to the corporate media sector in that regard. So that was factor one. Factor two is Annenberg in particular, but USC in general is just a hopping place right now. There are real leaders there, incredible visions that Annenberg is going to be thinking through the future of journalism, at a time the newspapers are going, belly up, and they're absolutely immersed in that issue. Have to be if they're going to think about where their students are going to get jobs and what the impact their schools are going to have on the society. And so the combination of those policy issues, the communication journalism side of my job title, and the media issues, the cinematic arts side, I can't think of a better place to be to explore those issues. So I'll be teaching courses on things like new media literacies, participatory culture, transmedia storytelling, all the stuff that emerges as big ideas in my book. But with transmedia storytelling, I can get showrunners and game designers and so forth into the class and engage in really interesting conversations to see what they're thinking and how they're responding to a lot of the changes that are taking place around us.
If I may, and you could tell me that this is how do conversations like that start? Do you come out and give a couple of talks out here and kind of sniff around, and someone says, how does it happen?
Well, it's interesting. We've run a conference, Futures of Entertainment, back at MIT that brings some industry people together. One guy came to that just as Convergence culture was coming out. He was on the team of writers on Heroes. And then the writer strike started, and all those guys were hanging out. So he was passing Convergence culture along to his friends in the picket lines, who were writers on various shows. And before I know it, I suddenly had a network of people here in LA who were responding to some of the ideas in the book. So it was a sort of strange story where labor issues led to new connections.
So suddenly the whole notion of being here made more sense.
It started to make more sense. I knew more people. I had a toehold that I could get into. Having USC or MIT after your name opens a lot of doors, but Hollywood is such a networked place that you've got to know a certain number of people in order to begin to enter into that network. And I'm just at the beginning of that process, but I know enough people now that people will return my calls, and I'm in a position to really start to study some of the internal decisions that are getting made around this. Right. And I'm sure that's going to be reflected in the next books that I do.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful to hear. And it's our gain. I happened to go up on your blog site the day that you announced you were leaving, and it was phenomenal to read people's comments. LA's lucky. We're shocked. We're going to miss you. Blah blah blah. It was really nice. And normally a professor doesn't really get that.
No, because of the blog, I've become quite a public figure as an academic. I'm really dedicated to writing my books so that they can be read by average people. Certainly, Convergence Culture and Fans, Bloggers, and Gamers are published by New York University Press, so that they're still university press books, but they're read by many people who don't have, university affiliations. And the blog just opened up that space. And so I bring together fans and industry people and journalists and so forth, and I bring them through the blog. I do a lot of interviews there and have discussions of contemporary debates around media and try to be someone who builds bridges between different spaces where media change is taking place.
I'm just thinking, by the way, that as I announced earlier, next week my guest will be Robert Wright. He, bloggingheads.tv is a venture he started, and it's so that the same thing where he can have this ongoing interaction and not go book to book.
Yeah, I'm impatient with the book to book interaction. I think I get ideas too quickly, and there are things I want to respond to while they're happening and want to have an impact on the discussions that are taking place around them. And so I want to break down that wall between the university and the public sphere in whatever ways I can. And the blog has been one of the central ways that I've been able to do that.
And you can find the blog at henryjenkins.org. That's not the blog's name, but go there and you'll get access to all this stuff. Let me ask a big question. I'm looking now. We got about a little less than 20 minutes left, and I got a few big questions. One is about democracy. Obviously, what we're talking about so far is a democratization of the media to some extent based on the participation of folks who used to be kind of just told to sit on a couch and veg. But by the same token, there's another group that would say that as people get, what are they blogging about? What are they tweeting about, and so on? And someone would say that their world is getting smaller and smaller, and so on. I interviewed the guys who have Millennial Makeover, Winograd and Heiss, I think, and they say that these people don't care so much what experts say as much as what their peers say, and so on. You've looked at this and you wrote a white paper on it. What do you feel the impact is for democracy, and maybe what we should be doing to make that impact as positive as possible?
Well, this is very much what the next phase of research I'm launching is through USC. Is I'm going to be looking at how do we get from participatory culture to participatory democracy. And as we think about all the videos made about Obama in the last election, how many of the young people who made those videos learned how to make videos making Lego movies or skateboard movies or whatnot? They learned to use this technology for fun. And gradually they developed an awareness of the world around them, and that led them step by step to engaging in the political process. And the campaign was open to their contributions, and it used social network technologies to allow them to find each other. And it publicized and circulated what they were producing in ways that were deeply effective. So we see that bridge, and so I want to really understand that bridge. Most work on civic engagement starts on the political side and has a very narrow notion of what politics is. So it helps you see what made someone an activist, but it doesn't help you see those people who are just on the bridge of moving into that space. And that's where the fan research gets interesting again. Because think about a letter writing campaign that you organize to get people to keep a show on the air. They have to do everything an activist group has to do. They have to identify the leverage points. They have to educate their constituency. They have to mobilize and organize their constituency, and they have to monitor the results of that decision making. By the time you organize one of those, you're going to be a dandy community organizer for another issue if you've in fact become politically connected in some way. So that's where something like the Harry Potter Alliance that I talked about earlier becomes really interesting, because we're seeing fans move from trying to leverage to keep shows on the air to defending their right to participate in the culture around battles over copyright and intellectual property or against censorship to beginning to take the visions of the works and see them as a social agenda, which the Harry Potter group is doing, and saying, that book's written by someone who used to work for Amnesty International, who deeply cares about human rights, who talks about prisons and manipulations of media. Is there a political agenda that we can get out of the Harry Potter books that can mobilize our change? Can we take our dreams or fantasies, in Stephen Dunkam's term, and use them to change society? We historically use play to learn things. In a hunting society, we play with bows and arrows. In an information society, we play with information. So everyone who's playing is learning, and everyone who's learning has the potential to turn that learning to something different. The question is, how do political organizations work differently to reach those young people? Do they use a different language? Do they think about politics in a different way? Do we talk about a politics that's closer to us, more intimate, more embedded in our everyday life, rather than I talk about politics as a lifestyle, not a special event? Right now, we talk about politics through elections. But if we think of it as a lifestyle, I'm a political being. What am I done today that's political? Then we have a very different vision of how an activist group would need to act. And I think that's what we hope to do in this research is learn how young people are forming a bridge between participatory culture and democratic participation. And then how do we take those best practices, teach them to activist groups, teach them to educators so they can help young people along that path.
And you've mentioned the Harry Potter Alliance a couple times. Is that their website, or what is their website?
I think it's just hpalliance.org.
But if people just Google Harry Potter Alliance.
Harry Potter Alliance or HP Alliance.
Come on.
This group was written up in Newsweek a couple of weeks ago.
You've read 5 or 6 of the books. Might as well join the movement.
Yeah, Andrew Slack, who runs the group, talks about cultural acupuncture, finding out where the pressure points are in the society and tapping them. And myth and stories and fantasies and dreams are really powerful motivators for people. We care about those things, and they open us up to issues. They don't brainwash us. They don't make us do things. But if you read the Harry Potter books and learn about the mistreatment of house elves and werewolves, maybe you think differently about human rights issues. And that's what's allowed them to build that bridge to fighting about equal rights to marriage.
I think that people have said for the last few years at least, whether it's Lakoff or Weston, et cetera, that the right had done a much better job of dealing with myths and narratives, adopting America's founders as superheroes and then claiming them and defining them so that the right was were the children of this movement by the way they defined it.
If you go back to the 1930s, the left was very good at it. The Popular Front, Aaron Copland's music, Norman Rockwell's paintings, the Abraham Lincoln Brigades, all kinds of things, Porgy and Bess, all kinds of things from the left were mobilizing myth very effectively to get people committed to the New Deal, the war against fascism, a lot of very progressive causes in the context of that society. The early history of American superheroes were founded by Jewish artists who wanted to get America more aware of what Hitler was doing in Europe, in part, and made that a theme of their stories, were after the war described as prematurely anti-fascist because they came out against Hitler before the government had.
That's right. One of the things that, and I want to just touch on this briefly, that is really discouraging and disheartening to me, is that the Obama campaign, in its campaign, based on someone who started out as a community organizer, did great use of social media, did great use of small contributions and so on, and made great promises. If we look at the climate bill, the likely health care bill, and perhaps more than anything, the response to the economic crisis, the influence of money. It's like up until Election Day, it was all about us. The influence of money on what policies are actually going to try to solve these problems, as I say, it just hurts my heart. I've said for a few years that we need the democracy trifecta of media reform, and it turns out media reform is happening in all sorts of ways. Public financing of campaigns, and election reform so the elections are really fair and so on. Can you see, in other words, I'm sure you see the same thing I'm seeing. How do we get to where there's more of a connection?
Yeah, it's a really tough challenge, and I think the media reform movement is one of the most important causes right now. I've had disagreements with some of the leaders of the movement over the years. There's old left, new left sort of things, cultural politics, and so forth. But it's time to rally behind the effort to reform media ownership, but also to fight for rights to participate. And for my concerns, I'm interested in the fights over, say, what I call the participation gap. That is how, not just a technical gap, but access to skills, cultural resources that allow people to fully participate in the affordances of the new media landscape we're talked about. I'm working on education reform has got to be part of, it's no longer a trifecta at that point, but changing the schools, ensuring that every kid has access to the means to social network, to communicate their ideas with each other is an important part of that.
Which is both a question of education reform and media reform.
Yeah, exactly.
That's where they meet.
They're absolutely bound together.
They have to learn how to read media and how to deal with media, but they also have to have access through
exactly. And when most people think about media reform, they're thinking about how do we break up top-down ownership, and they're still on a broadcast paradigm. And what I'm arguing is we have the potential to change that through participatory channels, but only if we fight for the right to participate, and if only we ensure the educational resources that allow people to meaningfully participate through those channels.
I know that media literacy is one of the things you're talking about. What's been the response? Any response so far in that? Because that's a movement that has existed.
Well, I think the difference, I think that we're collectively rethinking what media literacy is. I'm part of a network that MacArthur Foundation has set up to think about young people and learning in digital environments. And they have projects that are reinventing schools. They're starting a school in New York this fall that uses games and game design activities to get kids to think differently. They're reinventing museums. They're reinventing publication channels. They're doing things that apply ideas that collectively have emerged from our research that shows these things can be done in ways that reinforce education. We're developing curricular materials. The response has been mixed. There's a lot of fear-mongering out there and a lot of anxiety about these participatory channels. Even those schools where we have teachers we want to work with discover that they can't access YouTube through school. It's been blocked. They can't use social network sites through schools. They've been blocked. We have a project around Moby Dick, and the teachers discovered the school filters wouldn't allow kids to access sites on Melville's novel because it had the word dick in it. And, it's like our school filters are reduced to the level of sniggering fourth graders, which are blocking the opportunities for education. So this has to be part of the media reform agenda too. Opening up our schools to access to these participatory channels, and then ensuring that there's ethical education, that there's, the internet safety issues are addressed, that we go after cyberbullying, we go after the things that block kids from feeling comfortable participating in these online world, and we teach them how to organize and think collectively. And using social networks, including as citizens.
I'm going to mention one thing which I don't have time for you to respond to. Is just that there was an expression for a long time: interactive. Was media interactive when an audience could feedback and so on? And you say that that's really not what we're talking about now. We're talking about participatory.
Yes.
Media.
So I use interaction to talk about technical features,
right? And
participation to talk about cultural features. So we know that we can participate around a movie, right? It's technically not interactive, but we go to the theater, we shout things out at Rocky Horror, activists can organize outside and hand out brochures. That's not pre-programmed into the movie projector.
Right.
It is something that takes place around the movie.
But now I want to talk about something in the last few minutes here. We're on the radio here at Pacifica, at KPFK, and Pacifica and KPFK are a network of radio stations. They're a nonprofit organization. They're a brand of, progressive, peace-oriented, whatever. I'm sure if you poll listeners and non-listeners, you can probably get a lot of other words that fill in that brand, but there is a brand. There is actually a setup, which you may not know about, which is that there actually are local station boards that are democratically elected rather than appointed. Most nonprofit boards, are appointed. These people oversee the management of local stations. They send people to Pacifica National Board, made up all of folks who were elected locally. There's an awful lot going on there. At the same time, they exist in an environment where a radio station is just a little piece of what is possible and what they're competing with, right? We're competing. Someone mentioned the other day, in your car you could listen to CDs, you could listen to AM, you could listen to FM, you could listen to your iPod, you could listen to satellite, and soon you'll probably have more opportunities than that. And that in LA for KPFK, what button you push, what format you choose is going to have a great deal to do with how many listeners we have, how much money we make. Given all what's going on, what kind of advice, and I know this is not something you've studied up on, but what kind of advice would you give an organization like this to make the most of? We've actually suffered declining listenership and more, lengthening fund drives because of that and so on. What do you think is the ways we could take advantage of the future that we're actually moving into?
Well, there's first of all, I recommend you and the listeners check out a report called Public Media 2.0 that was from American University Center for Social Media, and looks at exactly the set of questions. And their key recommendation is to rethink what we mean by public media, not as media in the public service, which if we think about it, that's a kind of patronizing notion where we serve the public and we know what's right for them, or even publicly financed media, but media that mobilizes publics, which is a way of rethinking what public media is, media that publics organize around and through. And they look at a number of examples of public radio stations, newspapers, other sites which have created much more participatory channels through media. So we certainly see this in public radio doing crowdsourcing of topics and guests, which has been something that public radio in general has been a leading force in looking at. But there's a lot more that can be done with it. It also comes of stopping thinking of it as radio as isolated from the larger stream that we're talking about. And I'm delighted to hear you talk about podcasts and websites and so forth here, because radio is no longer a single technology. If it becomes an isolated space within the larger convergence culture, it is going to just disappear. It will be routed around. It has to constantly think of itself as engaged
in other
with
words,
other...
There's almost no more of an it. It's like this it that used to think it was a radio station or radio network is actually a relationship with a community.
Yeah, it is a social network.
And it's an information sharing relationship, and it had better realize that all those other things need probably in some ways more attention because it's a part we haven't been looking at.
And radio used to be thought of in narrow geographic terms. Increasingly with satellite radio, it's a national feed, which means it has to reconceptualize itself from a local community to a community of interest of some sort.
Let me just say that some of my proudest moments is when I get people who I've said, email me to get put on my weekly announcement list, and I get them from Bali, and I get them from Eastern Europe.
And people are reaching that through podcast without ever going through the radio. So in the Harry Potter world, the top fan-run podcast reaches 500,000 listeners every week.
Fan-run, half a million.
Fan-run, you
hear that?
Through podcast alone. We have no broadcast channel whatsoever. So we're seeing other systems that allow messages to flow. The question becomes, how do we justify broadcasting as the primary channel of accessing? And the third area to look at is cultural style, right? That there's a generational difference between, say, Democracy Now! And the Colbert Report. In terms of what politics we talk about, what's the attitude of politics to culture and everyday life, how playful, how serious, how whimsical our political discourse becomes. But young people watching Colbert and The Daily Show are learning about important issues and engaging them in ways that connect them to changing the world. And so public media has to rethink its style if it's going to connect with this younger generation that's grown up with YouTube and Facebook and the Colbert Report.
Very good. We got to leave it at that. So again, Henry's books are Convergence Culture, where old and new media collide, and fans, bloggers, and gamers exploring participatory culture. His site is henryjenkins.org. If you want to learn more about what all this means for KPFK and Pacifica, he recommends reading Public Media 2.0, which I suppose you can get online just by putting it up somewhere, and then go to his site and start interacting with some of the stuff, because we have a lot to learn. You can listen to this week's conversation and any others at any time during the week by linking to the podcast, and to figure out how to do that, email me at temcnally, one word, @mac.com. And I also send out a weekly announcement telling you who's going to be on and what we're going to talk about. Sign up for that by going to that email. This program will also be archived for the next 90 days at kpfk.org. Check audio archive, scroll down by date and time. Thank you, Henry Jenkins. Welcome to L.A. Keep up the good work.